It's nice to see so many friendly faces. I'm going to be talking about how we can evaluate the socialisation process through looking at children's artwork, what it can tell us about where they come from and their feelings of belonging to a particular place. Culture, as we all know, is a very complex and relativistic term. It doesn't detract from us using it all the time, but emphasises that there is a need to understand culture on a local level, and in particular how it is relative to a particular identity. Marcus Banks reflects that visual research methodologies tend towards the exploratory rather than the confirmatory, though I would argue that's actually a bit of a mixture of both. Are we working? There we go. So I'm going to discuss how I utilised a school art survey as a methodology as part of my PhD research. I wanted to do an intergenerational study, but we tend to focus on the elderly as having this valuable resource of narrative history, and quite often we forget about the younger members of society. And I thought it would be very interesting to utilise their ideas as well. So going from the youngest up to the oldest, as I could manage to get. So I'm going to discuss the research design, its implementation, how I went about doing it, a quick collation of results, and an analysis and interpretation. Now, I better watch my time because I think I did about 30 minutes when I was preparing this. So you could always just put up the numbers for me.
Yep.
Okay. So before we start, this is a quote from Clandon and Connolly from their book Narrative Inquiry. It's very much a narrative inquiry methodology. So if we imagine, as John Dewey did, research as the study of experience, what might the plot line for social science research be? The social sciences are concerned with humans and their relations with themselves and their environment. As such, the social sciences are founded on the study of experience. Experience is therefore the starting point and the key term for all social science inquiry. Furthermore, and this is the bit that I found particularly relevant, the experience of children needs to be reduced to something that can be measured in order to be researchable. So it's not just that it's a qualitative inquiry, you have to also make it quantifiable. They also say that people live stories, and in the telling of these stories, reaffirm them, modify them, and create new ones. Stories lived and told educate the self and others, including the young and those such as researchers. It's good to know. So the research design, how to go about an intergenerational study. Well, I've kind of given you a clue by calling it a school art survey. So how to include children. What Clandon and Connolly said was you reduce the childhood experience to something that can be measured. Can we measure artwork? I think we can. Now, it is an intergenerational discourse of child and geography studies, so I didn't just pull this out of a hat. There is actually a whole gamut of research out there utilising something similar. For example, the anthropologist Margaret Mead, John McKendrick, and Norwegian Ellen Boas. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Henning, is it Boas? Boas?
That's a strange name. I don't know.
Are you sure it doesn't have a circle above the A?
No, that's how it was in the book.
Oh.
We can always discuss that later.
I've never seen it.
So the reason for this is to investigate markers of identity. Okay, so can we actually read into a culture using children's artwork? Especially if it is their self-narrative of their own experience. So when I was doing the research design, I realised I wasn't going to be able to do this on my own. I had to collaborate with the Shetland Islands Council Education Department because what I wanted to do was have access into schools. And as we all know, working with children and entering institutional buildings like that, you need permission. So I had to collaborate with them. They invited me along to an arts teachers meeting where they wanted me to tell them everything that I was going to do. And from that, what happened was they said that they would actually do the school art survey for me in class. So I wasn't actually invited to be present in the classroom. They would take the information and disseminate it amongst the pupils and amongst the parents so that the parents knew what I was planning to do. Now, the age range is between children 4 to 13 years old, and the reason for the cap at 13 was because they didn't want it to conflict with school timetable, especially with exams. The reason being that they did it at the exam time of year, which was nothing to do with when I asked them to do it, but we'll come on to that later. Ethical considerations, it was a voluntary exercise. I wasn't demanding children do this. It was a non-curricular activity, so it wasn't actually something that the teachers were needing to do or encouraged to do necessarily, but they took it on board nevertheless. And like I say, there was a parental consent form sent home so that parents had full disclosure of what I was doing, and I had to get signed consent in order to involve the children and use their pictures for any research purposes. Now, I carried this out back in 2007, 2008, and it seems like a lifetime ago. It was back when I was doing my initial PhD research, and when this conference was being organised, I realised I hadn't actually presented the pictures to an audience, and I thought, what a shame, they're just sitting there. The children have gone to all this work, I'm going to present it. The children participated in various schools within Shetland. I will make another brief mention to that later on, because that is actually quite relevant as to which schools took part and which didn't. Like I say, it was a teacher-led activity within an established setting. The time frame was discussed with the teachers, who suggested incorporating it during their so-called quiet week. So although they were happy to be doing this for me in the classroom, it had to be during their own time schedule. And like I say, consent forms and guidelines sent out. So I'm not expecting you to read this. This is just to show you the example of the description and guidelines that I sent home, and on the back was the parental consent form. You might just be able to read, it says, the aim of the project is to produce an independent piece of artwork that illustrates the child's perception of their Shetland identity. The concept of culture is difficult enough for adults to comprehend, and I really didn't want to get stuck trying to explain this to children. So what I said to them was, to the teachers as a way of helping the children, was ask them, what does the word Shetland mean to them? Does that seem clear? Yeah? Yeah, the teachers didn't think so. They wanted more assistance. If they wanted more assistance, they should have invited me into the classroom, but never mind. So, the description says, this should be something which the child feels is particularly Shetland to them. It could be anything from a particular place, people, activity, environment, animal, or even weather, but it must not be done with another child or with influence from the teacher. Do you see a catch somewhere in here? Yeah. The teachers wanted to be able to help the children, but I was asking them not to influence what the children were producing. So I gave them actually quite a lot of information there, but let's just say that a lot of that was disregarded. And again, I wasn't there at the time, I wasn't able to enforce it. Oh, hello, what's that?
It's the font that's gone to some kind of ding-dings font.
That's quite nice. It should say the gallery by Shetland school children, but we'll stick with that. Okay. So we're going to quickly go through some of the images. I'm not going to talk all the way through or interpret everything that you see. I don't think it's necessary, to be honest. But I'm just going to flick through, and if you can try and just look out for similarities and differences in particular themes that are going through. Can you see all right from here? Yeah. Okay. So this is from some of the youngest pupils, as you can tell. Can you see a theme building up here? This is very interesting. We don't have high-rise apartments in Shetland, and we certainly don't have apple trees growing in the garden. But yeah, we'll come back to that. You might not be able to see this. That's an elderly lady sitting knitting in her house. And she's got bookshelves and knitted garments down below. It's a little bit stereotypical. I'm not quite sure if that was teacher-led or if the child actually knew someone, but that's part of the discussion for later. This is one of my favourites. This is by Andrea. She clearly has artistic skill. And again, following on from Andrea's picture, there are similarities with this one as well. I've tried to put them into specific themes to show you how I later categorised them. I'll read this one out. This is the Altair fishing vessel, and the pretty boy said, "I've been on it and I went to Denmark and Norway. It stays in Albury. My 2 uncles and my granddad and 10 other crew members work on it." I did actually ask the children to write a little bit of explanation to go with the images, but not all of them came with it. And I like this one too. This is Connor's. This is a beautiful piece. So it's not about saying how good the children can draw, how aesthetically pleasing it is. It is, again, to bring out the specific themes, but there are some beauties in amongst it. I'm sure you'll agree. And I don't know if there's any Doctor Who. Oh yeah, we've got one in the back. Do you not think that looks a little bit like a Dalek? It's meant to be a small house, so the perspective is a bit skewed. That's the ferry passing by the house. So again, it's a very relevant theme to islands and islanders. Then we've got knitwear. This says, "I love swimming" down the side, drawing attention to some of the facilities that we have in the islands. This was an activity that the teachers were keen to promote, and I was not keen for them to promote, using the quadrant breaking up of the page. It makes it really difficult to collate the information, because you get more than one result from one picture. So it's winter, spring, summer, autumn, but it does indicate that, you know, particular themes and the weather is clearly high on the agenda for this one. And again, the 4 quadrants. They've picked out different elements of what Shetland means to them. So this one's friends and family, fishing, Uphelia, the Viking festival, and wildlife in the bottom corner. Don't worry, this will be over soon. Again, this one's been broken up into 4 different settings. So you'll see some familiar themes coming through here, building up. This particular one is Victoria Pier. You can see the older we get in the age ranges, more complex images, a better understanding of locationalising. So we've got the ferry, we've got the pier, we've got people taking part in activities, and basically we've got interaction in the environment. And this one has a very clear understanding that we are separate from mainland Scotland. They've drawn Sombra Airport as the point of contact and what Shetland means to them. So clearly, Shetland to them is we're cut off from everywhere else. Then we move on to heritage. This is a representation of Musa Broch. Again, we've got the heritage here mixed with, did this work? Yeah, there's Sombra Airport up there with the plane taken off. You might wonder what all of this is. This is actually stones. As you see down here, these are the brochs, or the roundhouses. These are dwellings. It's the understanding that down at Sombra we have Jarlshof, we have Skatness, we have the history mingling with the modern. And then we move on to festivities. We have Uphelia taking place January to February each year in Shetland, throughout the islands. This one is clearly represented in Berwick because it's in the plain park. You can see the swings there. So the children are identifying places, they're identifying themes themselves. This one is taking a little bit of liberty. We don't actually put the boat out into the water. But you can see clearly that the child is putting together the different themes and strands that they are becoming aware of, whether through school, through interaction in the community, or discussions at home. This one's quite cute. This again is a jarl, the Uphelia. It takes a little bit of interpretation, and these arrows are the torches being thrown into the boat. So from a very young age, we're actually seeing the repetition of themes coming through in their artwork. These are the children's voices. This is their interviews, if you like. You might not be able to gather all this information if you're just sitting down and chatting to them. We're almost near the end of the picture show. This is a literally geyser. Can you see anything wrong with this picture? He's got a kilt on. Geyser jarls don't wear kilts. That's very Scottish, and that's a big no-no at Uphelia. Uphelia is meant to be Norse, it's not meant to be Scottish. Here's another one. And then just very quickly, You can see that there are more commonalities between the two pictures than there are differences. I'm getting the 5-minute warning. Lastly, I thought this would be an appropriate slide to finish on for the children's themes. This is the music festival, which again takes place at a certain time of year. So, in terms of what was returned, there was 128 images returned to me, but they were only from certain schools. And I had been of the understanding that this was going to be in every single school in Shetland. Unfortunately, because I wasn't actively involved in each classroom, I couldn't keep control of it. And it was just, 4 schools that contributed. Now, I categorised it using Gemma Penn's visual sociology semiotic analysis, whereby, well, it's just a first step. You take everything that's in the image, you just have a reference for each particular thing. It's maybe not the best way to do it, but it's certainly the simplest. And the 3 strongest themes were places, traditions, and wildlife. I've just got a few charts here to show you how strong these were. So you can clearly see the idea of Shetland as a place is the strongest. Now, that's not a surprise. That should be quite obvious. But then we're followed by wildlife and people. It's just putting a visual marker on what we know, but it's confirming something that is difficult to glean from just speaking to children. House and home and areas of Shetland were the strongest places of reference. The understanding of Shetland as home is very important. Children are identifying themselves within the landscape, within the environment, and within the community. The traditions referenced, you can clearly see Up Helia there. I think the reason for that is because the teachers used the Quiet Week in school, which was directly after Up Helia. So I think that's why we're seeing such a strong link to Up Helia and the Vikings there. So you can see some of the traditions referenced down the side here. Now, anyone who's familiar with Shetland culture and identity will recognise those. I'm quite sure the Arcadians in the audience will recognise those too. You've got Pete, the resting chair, language and dialect, you've got folklore, heritage sites, music, you've got architecture, croft houses, knitting, etc. So there's a lot of information to be gleaned from using this as a methodology. This is just wildlife references. Wildlife in general was very big. Again, it's an identification with the landscape and with what they're seeing on a daily basis. So, very quickly, have I got a couple of minutes? Yeah. So, analysis and interpretation. Norwegian researcher Ellen Boas has investigated the manner in which cultural heritage is taught in childhood institutions, focusing on small children's bodily encounters with history and tradition. So I used this image of children playing Clickman Brock. You might recognise from one of the earlier images the stone dwellings. The children are encouraged to actively go in and play, and as Ellen says, they encounter it bodily. There was a discussion yesterday afternoon, I think with yourself, Raggy, and Joy, and Neela, about the senses and how we experience things using our different senses. And it's important to remember that children are perhaps less intimidated to take part in activities. The adult is standing watching, but the children are having a whale of a time running around. Now, Richard Jenkins in Social Identity says, identity is a matter of meaning, and meaning always involves interaction. And I think if we can say one thing about the School Art Survey, it has shown just how actively involved children are in the community and how much interaction they are allowed to access. Ruth Benedict in Patterns of Culture says, the life history of the individual is first and foremost an accommodation to the patterns and standards traditionally handed down in his community. From the moment of his birth, the customs into which he is born shape his experience and behaviour. And by the time he can talk, he is a little creature of his culture. And by the time he is grown and able to take part in its activities, its habits are his habits, its beliefs, his beliefs, its impossibilities, his impossibilities. I'm not going to go too much into that because we're running out of time, but I think the important bit is about repetition and a child's repeated exposure and interaction within a given culture. So, very quickly to summarise or conclude, when viewed individually, the pictures can be difficult to understand because there's little context, except where there has been accompanying text. But when viewed as a collective, there are significant cultural markers that are identifiable because they're made quantifiable. I think that's an important point. And again, it's the repetition of these themes. It is an opportunity to hear children's voices, to let them express themselves, to let us see how they experience and absorb the world around them. I'm not saying it is a realistic way of assessing childhood experience, but it certainly does let you collect themes and perhaps work from the ground up. Now, like I say, several schools were not represented. I think the reason for this is probably something I won't get to grips with, but it does highlight that there are gaps in the geographical identities. There are small islands like Fair Isle, Fula, the Skerries, Bressa schools, so there's a lot of schools that weren't included, and it was my understanding that it was going to be filtered down throughout the whole corpus. Individual teachers insisted on doing it their way, which is fine, they were helping me out, but it made it very difficult to collate the information. The teachers felt it had to be just done within the hour in the classroom without letting the children take it home to finish. So I received a lot of unfinished bits of art. Now, my recommendations, building on this methodology, I would repeat it again, using it as a larger international project. And I would want to focus on not just Shetland, but Orkney, Shetland, Norway, Faroe and Iceland, involving other academics perhaps to undertake it. Coordinate with education departments and schools, not just with one person. I think it's important to remember to follow things up because sometimes information does not get passed along. And I would also want to encourage children to complete their works of art. I think there's a lot of information that's missing in just having a half-finished product. So, like I say, I would seek fully completed work, perhaps incentivise it with a competition to bring in more submissions. And given that I would like to do it as an international project, consider an exhibition or a publication of results, and to produce academic theoretical works based on the results from the pictures. So I think that's my time. Sorry, just one last thing, sorry. I just want to say I think the artistic contribution of children is definitely undervalued. When we're looking at narrative inquiry, we tend to focus on adults, and although they have a wealth of information that we are sometimes not able to access ourselves, we shouldn't forget about the children's voices. Thank you.